Okay, let's dig into this. You sent over quite a stack of material. We've got articles here from the Atlantic Council, Al Jazeera, Newsweek, some Wikipedia excerpts, even some Reddit discussions you flagged.
Yeah, and they're all circling around, well, one of the most critical and honestly fastest-moving global issues right now, Iran's nuclear program.
And how that intertwines with the conflict that's really flaring up in the Middle East.
Exactly. So think of this next little while as your personal deep dive briefing, based only on the stuff you provided. We're going to try and cut through some of the noise.
Pull out the really important bits, the key takeaways.
Right. The aim here is simple. Help you get a clear picture of where things actually stand, let's say mid-June 2025, using just this information you've gathered for us.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive: understand the current state of play with Iran's nuclear efforts, get the context around these recent, pretty major Israeli strikes.
And Iran's responses, yeah.
See how the world's reacting and kind of explore the different viewpoints in your sources on, well, how we even got here.
And maybe where things might be headed next, based on what's being said.
So where do we start? The immediate crisis.
I think we have to. Let's start right there, the boiling point. What your sources are describing happening, well, basically right now.
Absolutely.
Yep.
June 2025. It feels like a flashpoint, according to this material. Just days ago, June 13th, Israel launched this operation called Rising Lion.
Yeah, Operation Rising Lion. And the sources describe it as a pretty large-scale aerial assault, not just a minor skirmish.
And the targets. They went after significant sites.
That's what the reports say. Key Iranian nuclear facilities, military installations spread across several cities. We're talking Natanz, obviously, but also sites near Tehran.
Hitting nuclear facilities, missile factories, command centers, and your sources mention senior commanders and nuclear scientists were reportedly killed.
Which is significant in itself. But there's another side to this.
Right, the civilian impact. Your sources, especially that Al Jazeera piece citing Fars news agency unofficially, they stress indicate these strikes hit residential areas too.
Yeah, and that's resulted in dozens of civilian deaths. The number 78, maybe more, is mentioned. That's a really grim aspect of this operation.
And Iran didn't just sit back. The sources are clear on that. They retaliated.
They did, launching missile attacks on Israel. And according to Israeli authorities cited in the material, those caused civilian casualties on their side as well.
This feels way beyond tit for tat. Your sources remind us that Supreme Leader Khamenei had warned Israel beforehand, right? Talked about severe punishment.
He did. That warning was out there. And what makes this timing, this specific moment, so incredibly dangerous, according to your material, is that it's happening just as Iran's nuclear program seems to have crossed a major line, setting off international alarm bells.
You mean the IAEA report?
Exactly. The timing is uncanny. Right before the Israeli strikes, June 12th, the International Atomic Energy Agency formally found Iran non-compliant with its nuclear obligations.
And that's a big deal. The first time in 20 years, the sources say.
A huge deal. And it wasn't out of the blue. It was a direct response to what Iran's been doing with its enrichment.
Specifically the highly enriched uranium.
Yes, the uranium enriched to 60% purity. Your sources highlight a really sharp increase. As of the end of May, the stockpile was over 408 kilograms.
408 kilos, and that's up almost 50% just since February. That's fast.
It's incredibly fast.
Yeah.
And that 408 kilograms number, it really matters. The sources explain why. Getting uranium enriched up to 60% is, well, it's the hardest part of the job.
Right. The physics gets more complex.
Kind of.
Yeah.
But the leap from 60% to 90%, which is weapons grade, is technically much quicker, much easier.
So having that much 60% material means?
It means, according to the analysts cited in your documents, that Iran now has enough near weapons grade stuff for several nuclear bombs if they decide to take that final step.
And the sources point out Iran's the only non-nuclear weapons state doing this, enriching to this level.
The only one.
Yeah.
Which, raises obvious questions about intent.
And Iran's reaction to the IAEA censure, they didn't exactly back down.
No, quite the opposite. Your sources say that in retaliation, they announced they're activating a new uranium enrichment site, one that hadn't been disclosed before.
And they called it secure and invulnerable. That sounds concerning.
It absolutely is. Raises huge questions about transparency and monitoring. Plus, they announced plans to install even more advanced centrifuges at places like Fordo.
Which is already enriching to 60%.
Exactly. Doubling down, essentially. And it might not just be about the material. Your sources mention reports of a specific weapons program.
The Kavir plan.
That's the name mentioned. Apparently focused on designing the actual warheads and related tech. maybe building on expertise from that older AMAD project.
Which was supposedly stopped years ago, but the know-how probably remained.
That seems to be the implication. And all this together, the stockpile, the new site, the potential warhead work, it dramatically shrinks that breakout time.
How short are we talking now based on these estimates?
The numbers cited are pretty stark. Enough weapons-grade uranium for 1 bomb in potentially just a week. Enough for 7 bombs within a month.
A week. Down from years under the JCPOA.
Exactly. It's a completely different ballgame. So when one source you shared calls 2025 a decisive year for Iran's program.
Looking at enrichment, new sites, warhead tech, and this direct military conflict happening all at once.
Yeah, based purely on the material you've provided, it's very hard to disagree with that assessment. It feels like things are coming to a head.
Okay, so to really get why we're at this incredibly dangerous point in June 2025, we need to look back, right? How did we get here? Your sources must cover the history.
They do. And it's quite a journey. The program actually started way back in the 1950s, believe it or not.
With U.S. support, initially.
Yes, under the Shah. Ostensibly for peaceful energy purposes. Iran even signed the main treaty, the NPT, back in 1970.
But then came the 1979 revolution, the Iran-Iraq war. Things changed.
Dramatically. The program restarted, but secretly this time. Your sources talk about Iran getting centrifuge tech through illicit networks in the 90s.
And pursuing that weapons research program, AMD.
Right, aimed at designing warheads. Now, that specific project was reportedly halted in 2003, but the technical skills, the knowledge, that didn't just disappear.
And then key facilities started getting exposed. Natanz, Iraq, in 2002.
Then the underground Fordo site in 2009. And the key point your sources make is these weren't declared to the IAEA up front. They clearly had potential military applications.
All that secrecy and exposure eventually led to intense international pressure and negotiations, and finally, the JCPOA in 2015.
The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, yeah. That big multilateral deal, strict limits on Iran's program, verified inspections.
In exchange for lifting sanctions. And under that deal, the breakout time was pushed out to, about 2 years?
Roughly, yeah. A significant delay. But then came what your sources identify as a really crucial turning point.
The U.S. withdrawal in 2018.
Exactly. The Trump administration pulled the U.S. out of the JCPOA and reimposed even expanded sanctions.
And your sources draw a pretty direct line from that withdrawal to where we are now.
They do. They point out that since 2018, Iran's nuclear program has just exploded. Stockpiles way beyond JCPOA limits. Enrichment getting closer and closer to weapons grade. That 60% we talked about.
And other events like the U.S. killing of Qasem Soleimani in 2020.
Also cited as pushing Iran further. They eventually declared they wouldn't stick to any JCPOA limits anymore.
And we should remember, Israel's actions haven't just been this recent big strike. There's a history there, too.
Oh, absolutely. The sources mentioned things like the Stuxnet cyber attack back in 2010, which damaged centrifuges.
The assassination of the top scientist, Fakhrizadeh, in 2020, seen as a real setback for Iran.
Right. And even another strike mentioned from just last October 2024 that reportedly hit a weapons research facility at Parchin.
So it's this long pattern of Iranian advancement, secrecy, exposure, diplomacy, withdrawal, covert actions, and now overt military strikes. It's all culminated in this moment.
A very tense culmination. And alongside the military and covert options, the main tool used by the international community, especially the U.S., has been sanctions.
Right, economic pressure. Your sources detailed decades of this.
Yeah, U.S. sanctions in various forms going back to 1984, but they really ramped up in the 90s. Trade embargoes targeting oil exports.
And then massively reimposed and expanded after the 2018 JCPOA withdrawal.
Exactly. And the impact. Your sources paint a pretty bleak picture for Iran's economy.
The currency, the rial, its value has just cratered, hasn't it? Down like 80% since 2011.
That's the figure cited, yeah. Causing huge economic anxiety, making everyday goods super expensive for ordinary people, and efforts to control the black market for dollars seem to have failed.
Plus, restrictions on selling oil, their main income source, and being cut off from global finance.
Huge impacts. One source estimated the cost just to Iran's oil investments back in 2010 was maybe $60 billion because of sanctions.
And there's a human cost too, right? Your sources mentioned difficulties getting medicines, food.
Yeah, there are arguments presented that these sanctions cause real hardship for regular Iranians, regardless of the regime's actions. There's even mention of a civil society movement inside Iran protesting the sanction.
But here's an interesting point from your material. There seems to be debate about whether sanctions actually work in achieving the main goal.
Right. They clearly cause economic pain, no doubt. But some experts cited in your sources argue that these broad U.S. sanctions have basically failed to stop the nuclear program or change Iran's regional behavior.
And maybe even backfired. One view mentioned is that they might have unintentionally tightened the regime's grip by allowing it to blame outsiders for problems.
That's a perspective presented, yes. Meanwhile, the nuclear program itself has cost Iran a fortune.
The estimates vary, naturally, given the secrecy.
Of course. But the sources suggest direct costs over $30 billion, maybe way higher, over $100 billion even, if you factor in all the related infrastructure. That Bushehr power plant alone is mentioned as a financial loss maker.
Okay, so you've got the nuclear program at this critical point, direct military clashes, decades of sanctions with debated results. How's the rest of the world reacting to this latest flare-up?
It's a mixed bag, as you'd expect, looking at your sources. A lot of condemnation of the escalation, calls for restraint.
From who, mainly?
Well, the UN Secretary-General Guterres, the UN Security Council, countries like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Japan, the African Union, they all urged caution, worried about a wider war.
And concern about attacking nuclear sites while diplomacy was still supposedly happening.
That was a key theme, yeah. Protecting those facilities, avoiding a descent into deeper conflict was the phrase used.
But not everyone saw it the same way.
Definitely not. Germany and Italy called for de-escalation too, but Germany specifically added that Israel has a right to defend itself.
And the Czech Republic took an even stronger stance.
Much stronger. They're quoted viewing Israel's strikes as a reasonable reaction, pointing directly at Iran's actions supporting groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, pursuing the bomb. A very different framing.
And on the other side, countries condemning Israel's actions.
Iraq, Pakistan, and Hamas itself are mentioned, calling the strikes violations of international law.
What about the U.S. position in all this? Your sources say they've been supportive of Israel.
Broadly, yes. Providing military intelligence, diplomatic backing. President Trump is quoted wanting a real end to Iran's program, not just a pause, and believing Iran was very close to a weapon.
But there is a signal the U.S. wouldn't get directly involved militarily in this exchange.
Right. The Pentagon reportedly indicated the U.S. wouldn't be launching its own strikes against Iran in response to this specific Israeli operation. So, support, but perhaps with limits on direct participation.
And Iran's message back.
They warned the U.S. directly of painful responses, blaming Washington for being complicit in the Israeli attack. President Pezeshkian is quoted talking about unified armed forces ready to confront the Zionist identity. Strong language.
It really highlights these fundamental disagreements about how to deal with Iran, doesn't it? Your sources seem to capture this debate, sometimes framed as, what, appeasement versus containment.
Yeah, that framing comes up. The arguments against the JCPOA and for that tougher maximum pressure approach are laid out pretty clearly.
What are the main points there?
Well, the view that the deal itself was flawed, one source calls it shitty because it didn't tackle Iran's missile program or its support for proxies like Hezbollah, the Houthis.
And that the sanctions relief just gave Iran money to fund those groups.
Exactly. Plus a belief that Iran was just playing for time, intending to get nukes eventually anyway, and that the deal ignored Iran's destabilizing actions in the region. It's bullying.
Okay, but then there's the other side of the argument presented in your material.
Right. The counterarguments are equally strong. The main one being that withdrawing from the JCPOA was a disaster that directly caused this current crisis.
By removing constraints and pushing Iran to accelerate its program, bringing us from that 2-year breakout time to potentially just weeks now.
Precisely. Some argue that trying to engage Iran with incentives might be pointless given the regime's ideology, comparing it to failed attempts to engage with Putin's Russia, for instance.
Yeah. But others cited believe the opposite, that the containment policy clearly hasn't worked either, and that sticking with the JCPOA, even with its flaws, was orders of magnitude better than killing it and facing these consequences.
So really deeply divided views on the fundamental strategy, all laid out in the material you gathered.
Okay, so pulling all these threads together from your sources, what's the takeaway for you listening right now?
Well, based purely on this material, it seems clear Iran's nuclear program is more advanced and, frankly, more dangerous than it's ever been.
And this advancement is happening at the exact same time as direct, large-scale military conflict with Israel. A toxic mix.
Absolutely, and the international community. Clearly divided on how to handle it. Sanctions have bitten hard economically, but their ultimate effect on the regime's core decisions is, well, heavily debated in these sources.
And the different paths forward, diplomacy, pressure, military action, they're viewed through completely different lenses. Strong arguments on all sides presented right here in your documents.
Which leaves us in a moment defined by, frankly, sky-high tensions.
Yeah.
A lot of uncertainty about what happens next.
And a real looming risk of things escalating further, maybe pulling in other countries.
Exactly. So it leaves us, and you, with a pretty big question hanging in the air, based on everything we've just gone through from your sources.
Which is?
As Iran gets closer and closer to having nuclear weapons capability, and this conflict with Israel heats up, what options are actually left? Do any of the strategies outlined in these sources offer a genuinely viable path forward?
Or are we just watching an unavoidable collision unfold? Something definitely to chew on as you process this deep dive.